them in an ordered manner. Uh, the management system standard I mentioned has this order. They have, what you see on the left, there's 6 categories for hazard controls they use, and the 6 categories are in order, priority order. So they want the committees to look first at how can we eliminate the hazard. I think everybody agrees on that. Every author I ever read, everybody agrees on that. Their second one is substitute. An example is usually a chemical where you have maybe a quite highly hazardous chemical, and you can substitute a less hazardous chemical. So that reduces the hazard. It's useful. If you can't do that, then there's several engineering approaches. And then they say you move down to the last 3. There's warnings, and they put all kinds of warnings together. It could be alarms. It could be a poster on the wall. You know, it could be all kinds of different warnings. And then administrative approaches, the most common one would be training. Others would be like supervision and audits and things like that. And then personal protective equipment, they pretty much agree that they put that on the bottom because we'd rather prevent the incident from starting, but personal protective equipment helps avoid the ultimate injury or moderate the injury. I propose distinguishing between this list of hazard controls, the 6 categories of hazard controls. Talk about priorities instead. Have 2 lists, one priorities, one is your strategies. And instead of trying to say, okay, we're going to categorize all hazard controls into these 6 categories, and then we're going to force them to be in order. I question that because there's a lot of things that don't make sense in that approach on the left. Warnings, for example, who is to say that if you put a poster on the wall, a safety warning sign on the wall, is that more effective than providing training to your miners? I don't think you can distinguish which is more effective. They're all good, but most of you will probably do both. Probably have warning signs on the walls in appropriate places, on equipment, and you'll also conduct training, and you'll also require personal protective equipment, whether it's bump caps, hard hats, eye protection, knee protection, and so on. So I view those as being part of a broad category called administrative methods. So in priorities, if you see that right column, if you can't eliminate it, then use engineering controls, and that would include substituting a less hazardous chemical or taking say a sharp edge on something and beveling it or smoothing it out. And then it includes a number of different engineering controls. And then I put down at the bottom there all the administrative methods. I've added here, and this is a little different from the original PowerPoint to make it clearer. Over on the right side of this slide are risk reduction strategies. And there's 9 of them. That's what I put in the book. I think it's still a good list. Eliminate the hazard is good. And then there's 5 types of engineering controls that are all good. And they're not necessarily in order because sometimes substituting is great. Sometimes you can change the hazard. Sometimes you can avoid releasing the hazard. Sometimes you can separate people from the hazard. They're all good. It just depends on this application. And down at the bottom, you'll see a little difference between the left column where they have warnings, administrative, and personal protective equipment from mine, which says the third priority is just use administrative methods. And then I've added expedite recovery, which would be your first aid, your mine rescue, your environmental spill cleanup things. And so that kind of shows there's similarities between the ANSI approach, but in my approach, you separate priorities from the strategies. And I think that clarifies the way people could think about these things and use them in a risk assessment approach. So to summarize some of these messages, we talked about, can we advance the profession? Can we create a more unified profession? Do we really need to have practice of safety separated into mining safety, railroad safety, manufacturing safety, chemical industry safety, nuclear power safety? Do we need everybody inventing their own methods, their own approaches? I would say we should work at having more integration, more agreement, more collaboration. Methods-driven practice, I would also say in that case we should focus more on communicating, discussing, sharing our ideas. Risk assessment, for example, we might say there's 3 kinds of risk assessment and agree on that. And some of them are small teams, like a team of miners working together to do a risk assessment. On the other end, you have nuclear power plant, people looking at the hazards, engineers, human factors people, safety people all integrating together. So methods-driven practices, I think, could help to unify a lot of us. And then more precise definitions. Now, I just talked about hazard. I did not talk about definitions of risk, of which there are basically 3 kinds we use in our field. And then in the book, I do address those. But we use these terms all the time. We use terms like safety, and we use terms like risk, and we really ought to be more precise about them. You know, I've read journal articles, published journal articles in peer-reviewed journals where the author will say somewhere in the introduction what the definition of risk is, and then you start reading through the article and you find out he or she is not really using that definition. They're using a different definition. For some reason, they put one definition in the introduction and then they use a different one, because this is from not thinking through really clearly what definition you want to use. And I think whether it's in English or Spanish or Chinese, there's ways you can make the definitions the same in the broad sense. So let's see if we have some discussion, some questions. We have time to entertain your thoughts. If you'd like to ask, I have the translators here. There's a comment. Oh, you. Yeah.
A ver, por favor, las señoritas con los micros para, vamos a hacer una ronda de preguntas. A ver, levantamos la mano, por favor. Su nombre, de qué empresa vienen, por favor, para... Acá tenemos una pregunta. Por favor, el micro.
Gracias. Buenos días. Gracias por su exposición, interesante. Mi pregunta va con respecto a Mi nombre es Osvaldo Díaz, de la compañía Antamina. Con respecto al peligro, estoy consciente de que nosotros tenemos que estar identificando permanentemente peligros, ¿no? Con respecto al concepto de riesgo, tengo entendido que es la exposición. Entonces, la pregunta sería, ¿los controles que ponemos es al riesgo o al peligro?
I think that's an excellent question. I hope everyone could hear that. Yeah, the controls we put into place, in my view, are controls for the hazard. When you talk about exposure, the hazard could be a chemical, it could be poor ladder, defective floor, a number of different conditions that people are exposed to. And if we control the hazard at the basic hazard, then we're controlling the risk. We're reducing the risk for people. Example I give in school is, let's say you have a stairway with a handrail, and the handrail is getting loose from the wall, and someone points out, okay, this handrail needs to be fixed. You have one handrail on one stairway where everybody, when they first show up to work, they all use the same stairway. Another one that's used 2 times a week. So you have a high exposure on one, a low exposure on one. Which one are you going to fix first? And I'd definitely fix the one that has everyone's using it. So lots of exposure to a defective handrail in the one case. Similar with the chemical hazards, you want to reduce the exposure. You really want to reduce the dose, and the dose comes from being exposed to a certain chemical level. So if we can control the hazard, then that reduces the risk of developing a sufficient dose to cause injury or illness. I hope that helps.
La siguiente pregunta, por favor. Aquí, por favor, el doctor Valle.
Buenos días y gracias por su excelente presentación. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con un término que no es sobre los controles de riesgo de ingeniería, sino nos gustaría saber su opinión sobre la ingeniería de control de riesgos.
The engineering of risk control. I'm not really sure how to interpret that. The engineering would be of a approach to avoiding the harm causing exposure or causing injury or illness. We're not really engineering risk control, in my view.
Siguiente pregunta. Ahí, por favor.
Sí, buenos días, José Carrión de Xxii. En Perú estamos muy influenciados por los modelos de la década del 70, pues de Henrich, Beer, ¿no? A la luz de su experiencia, ¿qué revisiones deberíamos hacer de estos modelos o propuestas que han hecho estos autores importantes?
Well, the views on the Heinrich's models from the 60s and 70s, even earlier, I've been pretty much discouraged by the leading authors. Fred Manuel is a well-respected veteran of the field. He authors many papers, he speaks at many conferences. Fred Manuel presents a very good argument why we should abandon Heinrich's approach. One of the things is his approach was based on analyzing workers' compensation claims, and when he would analyze them, most of the people who filled them out would say the cause of the injury or death or whatever was due to something the worker did or fellow worker did. So his conclusion was that most of our focus should be on behavior. That was one of the things that's been criticized, that he relied too much on that instead of objective evidence. And another part is the triangle concept, where you have at the bottom of the triangle you have, I think this was Heinrich too, lots and lots of minor injuries, and then at the top of the triangle you have serious ones like death, and in between you have moderate injuries. And his approach leads people to want to fix all the minor problems with the idea that if you fix all the minor problems, the minor injuries, it will somehow prevent the death and serious ones. Manuel argues that you should focus on the major ones, the deaths and major explosions and mine collapses and so on. You focus on those if you want to prevent the major injuries. If you want to prevent the moderate injuries, you focus on those. If you want to prevent all the minor ones, you're probably going to spend a lot of time and miss the big ones. I think a big petroleum disaster we had in Texas in the 90s, the Texas City refinery explosion. The morning of this event, the safety department had a celebration that they'd had, I think, no injuries for like 2 years or something like that. And they were all excited about how great they did. And then there was a fire and explosion that killed like 20 people, you know, that afternoon. And that comes from example there. They focused on preventing recordable injuries, and they did not focus on big picture things like